Again, welcome everyone to Lux Art Institute's studio series with our current artist in residence, Cammie Staros. You can see Cammie here. Give a little wave. Hi, Cammie. This is now our second virtual artist residency since the COVID pandemic kept us all in our homes. However, this residency is a little bit different. We are now able to bring the exhibit into your home. Through many conversations, we have collaborated with Cammie to build a virtual environment that you can bring this exhibit that's behind me now into your home. And so please visit her exhibition by downloading the Lux Art Institute phone app by searching Lux Art Institute on your phone's app store. You can also follow some of the links that will be posted in our chat. It is available for both iOS for your Apple phone as well as for Android on the Google Play Store. You can enter the augmented reality portal to experience Lux's exhibition space with Cammie's works and the rising waters. You see they're very still right now because that's a screenshot that I took, but the waters do rise and they go all the way to the ceiling. So if you spend enough time in the space looking at the works, you can also experience the entire space flooding around you. Or you can use the augmented reality home feature to place her objects in your living room, and you can walk around them and go up close to them, and you can also spin them around with your finger. So I'd like to thank the staff and the board of directors at Lux for supporting this virtual engagement, and to Another Reality, the name of the studio that helped produce this app. We are looking forward to returning to our physical space in September with the beginning of our next season, but we will continue to provide virtual engagements like this in conjunction with those presentations. So a reminder tonight, this studio series is usually a paid event, and while we are pleased to offer it to you for free, I'd also like to ask that you consider making a donation to help support Lux through these times. Victor on our team, he's in charge of our visitor experience and does all the tech for all of our webinars. We'll be posting details on how you can make a contribution tonight, either through our website or through Venmo. Any size is beneficial to continuing our programming in the future, and all gifts are 100% tax deductible. So thank you very much. This presentation will be recorded tonight and posted to YouTube. You can also view the dozens of virtual programs we've produced over the past few months by subscribing to our channel on YouTube. And lastly, Cammie will be working with our education department on a private ceramics workshop. You can visit the classes page on our website for more details and to sign up for that workshop. You may also ask questions throughout tonight's program through the Q&A. We will have a Q&A session after Cammie has presented. I'll begin that Q&A with a few different questions to get us started, but we'll be definitely answering some of the questions from all of you. Cammie presents her exhibitions in a virtual Lux gallery. They are submerged beneath rising seas. Her sculptures reflect a long-standing interest in ancient Greek vases and their museological framing as origin points in the story of Western art history. Classical amphorae or ceramic Greek containers were themselves vehicles for storytelling, but Staros eschews narrative depiction in favor of a more subtle and reduced use of symbols and patterns. In this way, she draws a through line between classic antiquities, modern art, and contemporary culture. Cammie was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and received her M.F.A. from the California Institute of the Arts, CalArts, in Valencia, California, and her bachelor's in Art and Semiotics from Brown University. She has exhibited at Shulamit Nazarian Gallery in Los Angeles, where she is currently represented, Ghebaly Gallery in Los Angeles, CalArts, Otis College of Art and Design, and Galerie Lefebvre Fils in Paris, France. She was recently in an exhibition at Craft Contemporary in Los Angeles and featured in the publication 100 Sculptors of Tomorrow by Thames and Hudson. In March of this year, she received an esteemed Guggenheim Fellowship. And so I'd like for you all to please join me in welcoming Cammie Staros. Thanks, Cammie.
Thank you. Okay, I will transition from this view to a slideshow, maybe. So I'm going to be doing a guided tour of the virtual exhibition at Lux in a couple of weeks. So tonight I thought I would speak on my practice more broadly and on some of the ideas and themes behind it. So I'm going to start today with the beginning of my conceptual relationship with antiquities and my working relationship with ceramics, which really go hand in hand. These first few images are probably obviously not my work. But they're really what motivated my entry into ceramics and they continue to be central to why I'm still working with clay and the kinds of clay that I work with. So these are a few examples of Greek black figure bases. Athens was the hub of this kind of amphora, which again is just the name of this sort of vase shape. And the examples I tend to return to were made between about 400 and 650 BCE. And the figuration is usually narrative, detailing allegories or sports triumphs. So as Andrew mentioned, I concentrated in art and semiotics in college, and I also attended a theory-heavy grad school. I did a fair amount of art history too, which probably won't come as much surprise, but it was my interest in semiotics at least as much as history that led me to using these antiquities as a conceptual springboard. Line of inquiry, semiotics, is often defined as the study of the sign. For those of you who don't know, I find that a really vague and self-referential definition. And I think of it more generally as the cultural philosophy of how meaning is made and conveyed with particular relevance to how that's accomplished visually. And in grad school in particular, I was making a lot of work about various visual systems of representation out in the world, like measurements or hand signs or things like that. But after grad school, I soon realized that art history itself was the system or the network of systems that ultimately compelled me. So I started getting really interested in these Greek figure bases, both because of their narrative representational nature, and as Andrew sort of alluded to, for me, they really came to represent this kind of origin story of Western art history. The Romans imitated Greek relics and began both a linear version of history, which is, of course, much messier. But I'm interested in how museums tell a story through the selection and display of objects, and also how later European movements took on classical themes and perpetuate this cyclical aspect of art history. I also wanted my work to be both of and about its own historical lineage and the broader systems for telling those lineages. I felt like that kind of historical connection was not something I was seeing a lot at the time that I started this work. So in parallel with the antiquities themselves, I'm interested in how it's conveyed, how the story is conveyed, how the image is cropped, how the pedestal functions, how the vitrine protects and the museum frames its objects. Or put another way, I'm interested in both the antiquities and the context, like in this image, in which we view them. This is an image from the Met's photo studio that I've used a couple of different times. And I really like how you see everything going on outside of the frame and the great care to eliminate all of that in the photographer's image. And indeed, the first thing I started with was photographs of the objects I was researching in a standard historical text. I made a couple of drawings of John Boardman's Athenian black figure vases. And I drew the page spread, including the pots, the shadows, the glares, and the weird croppings of the photographs. But I left out the namesake figures and also the captions, where, those places we turn to find meaning. I was interested in what was left and how much could be identified of the type of book and of the type of ceramics being described. But a few drawings did not satiate my appetite for the subject, and I knew I wanted to make sculptures that related to these ideas and to the ancient vases. But I didn't know at first exactly what form they would take. I did realize, however, that I would need to start working in ceramics, which was a medium that had not even been offered at either Brown or CalArts. So I did a residency at Anderson Ranch, which is well known for its ceramics. Although I got in for sculpture, so I had to sort of weasel my way into the more storied department. But there I happily immerse myself in the clays and slips that the ancient Greeks and Romans used. And knowing that I wanted to make sculptures of pots rather than throw utile ones, I pretty quickly abandoned the potter's wheel for a hand-built approach, which felt like it spoke to that sculptural application better. And at Anderson Ranch, with the help of their ceramic faculty, I really felt my way towards the working methods, the techniques and the materials that have become the real backbone of my practice. I knew from the beginning that I was not interested in making updated versions of Greek vessels, but in making sculptures that reference the history I was interested in and some of the reasons for that interest. So none of these vessels pictured, nor their combination, are actually finished pieces. These are just the very first ceramics I made. This, however, is one of the first sculptures that I completed in this new medium. And it kind of marks the beginning of my first solo show at Francois Ghebaly, which I'll go through. I'm mostly just going through solo shows as like a framing device for this talk. This piece also was the beginning of my move away from constructing these pots as one would normally conceive of a pot. And I began doing things like making vessels upside down. So you can see that here. And part of that was to make the sculptures work just functionally, but a lot of it was to draw this distinction between utility and inutility, between a pot and a sculpture of a pot. As you can see, I also started combining the ceramics with other elements. In this case, these walnut sort of hieroglyphic arm brackets that I carve are playing with ideas of display tropes and utility in a very different way, but they've also come part of my sort of personal lexicon. I also began making them hollow all the way through. This piece is held up by a series of penetrations. You can see the brass rod itself just goes into a hole in the ground. This piece is titled Leda, for a Greek allegory that's depicted a lot in art history. It's the story of Zeus taking the form of a swan to seduce or rape, depending on the version, young Leda on the eve of her wedding. And I think this work sort of shows one of the things I strive for in my works, which is to embody apparent contradictions. So to be sort of both funny and serious, perhaps, or both elegant and lewd, or most importantly, and most kind of fundamental to the way that I think about my practice, both conceptual and crafted. And from the beginning, many of my works flirt at the edges of figuration and anthropomorphism, or they contend with how bodies use space and architecture. The two openings on this piece, for example, are standard doorway sizes, and the one that I showed you in the corner are hung at the height of my shoulders. And of course, I'm thinking a lot about these works in relationship to various histories. I've made several works in this vein. This one was the first. These stacked sculptures, I think, point to the formal and functional similarities between ancient Greek ceramics and those native to the Americas. Their repetitive undulations reference modernist sculptures, like specifically Brancusi's Endless Column, which the title also references, as well as North American totems. And layering all these incongruous references is my way of addressing the murky and malleable material of influence, precedence, and understanding. I also really try to avoid making didactic work or even work with a singular read, preferring this kind of layering of illusion, making visual analogies, and allowing multiple interpretations to coexist. Since the figuration on the Greek pots that I reference is so tied to their meaning, my love of ambiguity means that I tend to avoid direct figuration. The birds on the topmost ceramic shown here are about as close as I've come. But I regularly reference the figure in the form and the attitude of the vessel itself. This piece, called Reclining Nude, plays with multiple art historical allusions, including its namesake trope, the Greek amphora, the fractured columns of ruins, evil eyes, and modernist painting. And I'm interested, as you can see through all of these, in the ways that historic motifs affect our artistic expression and understanding. So these are a couple sort of reference images of some classical reclining nudes, and then how that trope reappeared in modernism. This one's Malwa, outside of the Getty and Henry Moore. So I've talked about works in relationship to architecture, to the body, and to history. And I would just add that with this first body of work, with this solo show, this first solo show, I was also really interested in how they relate to each other. I think shows or exhibitions have the opportunity to build meaning from one piece to the next and from those relationships. So in that vein, I installed this guy kind of as a reference to a shadow of the column piece, which you can see here. So that kind of makes up the body of work that was in that first solo show at Francois Ghebaly. And I guess I would just add that there were two doorways into the space, and another way that those relationships between objects was important to me was I created viewpoints from those two entrances of the gallery that made, for example, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but made this ceramic that's like suspended in blinds appear to be held by the walnut hand on the right. And I did things like that with this like kind of a visual double entendre or something, like a visual pun. I didn't know it at the time. This is just the other view of the same show. So that's the other doorway. But I think that this show is like a good place to start a lecture also, because it was really kind of an establishing shot of my interests. And later work, as you will see, can be a little bit less legible in those initial references to antiquity and make references that are even further afield, because at this point I'm now building on a constellation of references and interests that I've set up for myself through this show. And the next show, as luck would have it, was in Paris, where I went for 3 months to make it, so I could actually go to Brancusi's atelier and see some endless columns for myself. I was recently asked why I focus on the modern and contemporary artists that I reference. And it's very similar to my logic with the Greek relics. I reference work that is iconic and that has come to symbolize its time or movement in some way, partly like just because it is iconic, you know, and to look at that again or look at it askance. And I think of Brancusi as kind of the epitome of a modernist sculptor. And of course, there's Picasso. And I also, of course, went to his museum in his old house and studio. And doing a show in Paris, I knew that I wanted to specifically look at these giants who spent their working lives in Paris and still loom so large in that city. And I wanted to connect them to these figures of modernism and surrealist art with the histories that had inspired them. I think the classical influence is especially evident in this Picasso sculpture. And also, I think I said also surrealism. This is Marcel Bruthier's, as is this. And I was reading a lot of surrealist writing, notably André Breton and Georges Bataille. and I came up with this show. I had a French assistant for a month of my production time and spoke only French to him. So when the gallery asked me to write a press release, I couldn't form an English sentence. And the thing that came out was more like a poem that borrowed some expressions from the surrealists I was reading and some funny translations and a lot of notes that I had been taking while walking around Paris. So the titles of this show are all excerpts of that press release, including the title of the show and the piece on the right, which has the same title, The Double Beast Coupled. I made this installation as part of that show, kind of in direct contrast to the idea of like an easy shelf object. I'm just not that practical, and in case it's not yet obvious, I take great pleasure in pushing against expectations. This is just an installation shot of that show. Another totemic piece. This is the first work I did with neon, which I'd been wanting to do for a while. My thinking on it has changed a little bit with each project, but in the beginning, it seemed like sculpting with a line, like going to the essence of the difference between 2 and 3 dimensions. And I think it becomes the things one can draw with a single line in space. You know, it becomes a snake or a rope or string or a sign. And by combining it with these arm brackets, it further makes it a thing that can be held, sort of objectifying the line and the light. And I was also, of course, thinking of Picasso's light drawings, which were like this freezing of a gesture of an object. He made these by drawing with a pin light, so they could really only be seen in these photographs made with a long exposure. This piece was the one in the show that feels the most surrealist to me. I showed you those brutes with the egg shells and the mussel shells, and I just kept coming across these comparisons or conflations between eggs and eyes, pearls, and shells. So I made this piece kind of in response. And I used real shells too. If you look closely at this piece, you can see scallop shells acting as shims for this rather large and very heavy ceramic sculpture with a rounded bottom. I think I've already mentioned how impractical I am. This is the piece in this show that kind of has the most pointed reference to Picasso, and the next image will show that even more. It also, I think, illustrates pretty literally another of my pet philosophies, which is to respect and to reward my viewer. So this piece was visible from this angle in the show, but it was really hard to squeeze around that ovular pedestal. But for those curious enough to do so, they got a wholly other view and another layer of meaning and of reference. And again, I like to reward that curiosity. So that was the full circle of the Double Beast Coupled show in Paris. And pretty soon after I returned, Shulamit Nazarian invited me to do a solo show. But perhaps because I had just done one, I was interested, pardon me, I was interested in playing with the differences in convention between solo shows at a gallery and a historical museum, where they might include a few works by influential predecessors and peers. So all of the photographs, paintings, and collages in the next few images are works by other artists that I curated into that show to kind of point to those differences in convention. The one on the right is a photograph by Sarah Vanderbeek called Baltimore Aphrodite. And the works I chose all dealt with some of the same ideas I was thinking about at the time, namely heroics, sexuality, classical form, the construction of all of those things, I particularly liked this pairing though, of Van der Beek's oversized photograph of the decapitated Greco-Roman statue and my sculpture in the center. That's kind of a picture. It's got this one handle that I also thought of as a disembodied head, you know, almost as if her head had fallen on the floor. And the neon in it, I see is maybe a snake charmed out of its pot, or a wisp of smoke rising, or like the most beautiful entrails from that disembodied head. I thought of the works in this show, I sort of conceived of them as existing in one of 4 categories. So there were the works by other artists, there were the large sculptures that were all in one way or another these ideas of disembodied heads, and again, violence was like a big part of the show. And then there were these 2 kinds, which were, pardon me, there were the wall slabs on the left, and then the piercing pots, like this one on the right, which I'll go into a bit more. With all these works, I was looking at artifacts that deal with eroticism and violence and victory, with kind of an eye toward their contemporary counterparts. And I see vestiges of ancient armor in piercings and tattoo in leather and BDSM gear. I think there's kind of a shared aesthetic in that line. The title of this work, Eros and Anteros, comes from the winged love gods in Greek mythology and can be translated as love and requited love. And the 2 ceramics you can see are, again, they're each amphora in a way that are inverted to resemble heads with handles scaled down like ears or buns. And the photograph in the corner is Whitney Hubbs. I liked this, this similarity in the ripping curtain or the ripping paper and the pattern I did on these heads, which was like a zipper motif, which itself was a combination of a Greek key and rows of triangles, which are both quite common patterns on Athenian Black figure vases. But of course, I'm reusing them and re-identifying them. And the resulting piece, I think, looks like ancient vessels upside down with neoprene koozies, or like heads wearing BDSM masks. Like this one, for example. And this is the last of the sort of disembodied head pieces from this show. I have several works that are this basic shape in the Lux show. And with all of those, I was thinking about the vulnerability contained in a head on its side as if falling arrested. And it conjures up ruins, I think, more explicitly too, which I'll talk about more in a bit. But 2 examples of aslant sculptural disembodied heads held particular resonance for me. They're these Medusa heads pillaged from Roman ruins and inverted and repurposed as column bases in the Basilica Cistern in Istanbul. And again, Brancusi carved similar forms quite often as his Sleeping Muse. And these 2 models of, you know, pre-existing sculptures came to represent for me kind of 2 poles, the literal and the metaphoric borrowing of classical forms, the depictions of women as either femme fatale, as embodied most articulately by Medusa, or as the muse of the vanquished head and the sleeping one. So this is another sort of surprise that I gave the viewer. This piece I installed facing the corner, and only if you looked did you see the eye. But the ovular form of this piece is the part of it that kind of points to Brancusi, while the snakes covering its surface, of course, allude to Medusa's serpentine locks. And then this column shape, this is actually a rusted pipe column that is a reference to the cistern in Istanbul, to its sort of watery function and the columnal form, and also to the violence of Medusa's story. You can just see the line work a little bit better there. So these are the inverted Medusa heads I was referencing. This one is completely inverted, and this one is the one on its side. And then Brancusi carved similar forms many times, but these are a couple. So that brings us to the next series in this show, which were these piercing pots. This is a Fay collage on the left. These are bigger than they look in photographs. You can see this one's like 26 or 27 inches high, and it's the shortest of them. But in the previous show, or in not the previous one, in the first show that I showed, the one at Francois Ghebaly, you could see I was really using the positioning and the weight of the pot to get at like an anthropomorphism and that sort of bodily read. And with this show, I used other ways that we manipulate our bodies. I used designs mimicking clothing, tattooing, and like in these pieces, piercing the pot. So in this one, I'm playing with the pattern alternating between like a Greek column, a Doric column or something, and a dress, a form first subtle, first solid, and then supple. And the rings themselves are made with balls that screw into the ends. Again, these pieces are hollow, so I can kind of like shove my arm up the bottom of them and screw these brass ends on the rings. So they're made like oversized septum or navel rings. The pattern on this one is based on chainmail. And the piercings are, of course, also stand-ins for handles. The more literal pair on this piece is made like post-back earrings with scaled up butterfly clutches on the inside, for those of you who wear posts. So that's a close-up. This is a medieval effigy, brass effigy that my mother did a rubbing of. It's 4/5 human scale or something like that. It's quite large. And I grew up with this Sir Henry Beers rubbing in my house. And I got that chainmail pattern directly from this. But I was also looking at these, at the figuration and their positioning and their clothing and their armor on Greek figure bases. This one's Athena. She's very recognizable because of her armor. She's almost always depicted with this shield and helmet. And that helmet is what inspired this piece in particular called Minerva, which is another name for Athena. But these wall slabs are all sort of, you know, minimalist like reductions of real or imagined armor that I was seeing. So helmets, this one's like a breastplate or shield, another breastplate, another like chainmail reference. Another totemic piece. This was not in that Shulamit show, so that show is now over, but I made this one right afterwards, and you can see I'm still sort of like working with a lot of the same themes and methodologies. And in this close-up image, you can see the ball ends of those piercings. You can sort of see how they function better. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. So despite a clear love, I fall pretty hard sometimes for extreme detail. I have a lot of minimalist tendencies, and I often try to reduce a reference down to its most essential features. So a couple of years ago, I started, or I guess this was just a little over a year ago, I started working more with bare clay pieces. And you can see I'm like dialing in the firing and the clay bodies pretty precisely to get this ombre, and use other kinds of decoration in lieu of the painting that I had been doing with terra sigillata. The day after I finished that former totemic piece, I filleted my hand open, and I had to get same-day surgery, and I couldn't work for months. I already had the idea for these next pieces in mind, so I don't really know how relevant that was, but I have a lot of ideas I don't make, and it doesn't seem entirely unrelated to these distorted, asymmetrical, organic amphora I started making as soon as I did return to the studio. I wanted to make things that reference those same Greek amphora, but I wanted to make them vulnerable and intimate and organic shapes. I also wanted to incorporate the materials and forms used to display the antiquities that I keep referencing. So way back in the beginning of this talk, I talked about the museum and display, but other interests had kind of like pulled me in different directions. And I wanted to get back to that initial interest. So I think of the acrylic elements in these sculptures as part pedestal and part vitrine. But you can see the ceramics are not only sort of bent and twisted, they all also have pointed or rounded bottoms, so they can't stand up on their own. And that inability to stay upright is, for me, a way of incorporating and reiterating the importance of the acrylic elements as integral to the piece and not just as sort of a display mechanism. You can see I'm still doing piercings. I switched to stainless steel for this piece. I also think that they highlight this dual aspect of relics, of always looking both to the past and to the future, to imagine today's objects displayed in museums or left to decay. And you can see that reflected in my titles. This one's called Sunken City. But I've been focusing more on the construction of history and on the historical role of the antiquities that I reference and that I began this talk with. But I think ruins trace the fall of empire, and they're both like celebrations of humans' accomplishments, and they expose the fragility of human power. And I'm increasingly interested in this future that they sort of allude to and foretell. And it seemed time to incorporate questions about the impact we have on this planet and the legacy of our species. So this is a brand new For Your Eyes Only sneak peek work that's another hybrid display as sculpture that highlights the devices that frame the way we view historical objects. This is just a snapshot on my phone in my studio. And it's the first of what I hope to be a series of pieces that combine a more standard museological vitrine into an aquarium. And I think the use of water here evokes the threats of both flood and drought. I think submerging the ceramic objects kind of points to that, the transition of that material from mud, which would disintegrate in water, to its fired form that can far outlast its maker. And I think perhaps most importantly, that the drowned museological display flattens historical time, simultaneously suggesting the ancient past, the underwater discoveries of those antiquities, and a possible future of today's art objects. This is a rendering of those same pieces. This is not the virtual exhibition, but I think it's a great thought to end on with respect to the show at Lux. These pieces imagine a museum that's been forgotten and reclaimed by nature, and the virtual show at Lux let me expound on that idea in a different way, combining new media with the oldest of media. As I said in the beginning, my work is both of and about its own lineage. So I think it was perhaps only a matter of time before I began to question what may become of that idea of that lineage and of art more broadly, given all the current and impending crises. And I think with this work, I'm trying to articulate why it's important to look backward. That is, in order to better see forward. So that's the end of my talk, and I will be delighted to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Cammie. That was wonderful. Very great look into the history of your work over the last 10 years or so. Virtual round of applause. Thank you so much for that. Yes, if anyone does have any questions, there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom, and you're also welcome to add anything to the chat box if that's easier for you. Cammie, a lot of things came to mind while you were talking. I had prepared some things beforehand, but one thing that really captured my attention, and I just kept seeing it throughout your work, is the concept of ambiguity. And you mentioned it very much in the beginning. There's a bit of an ambiguity as to what the objects are referencing in some cases, or if there's a direct historical reference, or if there's a shape that you're intending to be somewhat anthropomorphic, but could also simply be the amphora that you're producing. I am curious if you could talk a little bit more about what ambiguity means to you. And also, I know that in semiotics, ambiguity is it's a big topic because we consider that everything has some sort of relationship in semiotics. So, what does it mean to be ambiguous in a world of relation?
Well, this is a little bit off, but related to the semiotics part at the end of your question, sort of fundamental to the idea of semiotics is that the sign that references, the symbol that by which we come to a concept is itself arbitrary. And so part of my interest in kind of how we got to where we are in art history is tracing those, what seems like a potentially arbitrary lineage that could have started somewhere else with other things. And I think, those two ideas, are the arbitrary and the ambiguous, are not synonymous, but I think they are related. I also, like I said, I really welcome multiple reads at the same time. I think that tends to happen in art anyway. And so I really like to highlight that process and push multiple reads at once. I also just really hate feeling like any kind of work, artwork, but writing, doctors, whatever, speak down to their audience and speak as if the participant has no role in interpreting a piece. And so while I feel like I have really specific references, I also allude to them with these kind of minimal gestures in order to allow that process of interpretation to remain fertile. And like you said, in semiotics, everything references something, everything means something. So I think I'm sort of exacerbating that energy that exists in art and its consumption and its viewing and its interpretation already.
Thanks. Yeah, that really makes me think about just kind of the experience of being with art too. We're in a situation right now where we are not able to experience artwork physically in a space, and so those subtle cues, I think, are what we really depend upon to be able to make art our own. When we go into a space, and I love the Socratic method when you're looking at artwork, what do you think about the artwork? How do you feel about the artwork? And I think that you're right, those subtle cues allow you to really dive into your own perception of it. And I think that's like an age-old way of working with artwork. And in some ways, in many ways, that leads into the next question I have, which talks about the Greek historical references that you have in your work. So what I see is, and I know that there's a question in the chat too, we'll get to that shortly. One of the most endearing aspects that I find of ancient Greek pottery are the mythological stories that they tell. So
Mhm.
even if you don't know the tale, kind of like what we were just talking about, you feel like you can follow some sort of story. And they touch on sexuality and love, violence and war, godliness, things that you mentioned in your talk. You also touch on these same subjects, but they're much more abstract. And so I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the evolution of storytelling within your creations as it relates to that historical mythological stories, and how we might be able to return to some of those old objects, the ancient pottery, to be able to help utilize some of your methods of storytelling to reinterpret those stories.
Well, the thing that actually like really got me into the Black figure bases specifically was precisely the legibility of the stories depicted. And I had already been really interested in this kind of like triumvirate of objects and language and bodies and ways that those things interacted. And I felt like on those vessels, the bodies get like, they get reduced down to like a real language. They become sort of codified. And even if you don't know Greek allegories, you can kind of tell what's going on. You know, they're like very broadly legible. And there are definitely, there have been artists who use the form of Greek figure vases to tell contemporary stories. And they'll, you know, they'll have, either in sculptures or in painting, like clearly contemporary figures interacting on a vase or something like that. I was less interested in the specific stories that those vessels were telling and more in their sort of the story that they tell more broadly historically. So I look at lots of things, but in general, my work does not reference like a particular sculpture so much as it references a thing I see over and over again in sculptures or in these vases. And it's like the, I'm interested in the tropes, but I'm also interested in like the role of those pieces themselves in history. And so getting bogged down with telling, with narrating things on my own sort of seemed like beside the point to me, beside my personal point, somebody else's point.
That's a really good point. And I think in some ways to relate it back to your last point, which is the personal storytelling that we take, you know, we ourselves prescribe a story to the objects that we see. And I think that your works allow that same sort of interaction to take place. The comment in the chat was more around the concept of conservation. And actually that's perfect because it leads into my next question. And this is more specific to the exhibition that is on Lux's app. So in the application, you've, which you can see on my virtual background here, you've inundated the gallery with water, something that you wouldn't be able to do in a normal gallery space, or perhaps you would be with a lot of engineering. But as you remain in the space, the artworks slowly become underwater relics. They're not just being sunken, but they become relics in some ways. There's a deterioration of the walls, there's a discoloration, and you feel like you're looking at these objects that have been sunken for many years, if not millennia. So do you imagine your works eventually becoming relics? Or is that more of a conversation about the museum space and the common identity of museums as being somewhat old and stodgy? And then a second portion to this question is related to this and very apropos for this moment, is the conversation about the return of objects to their original land or people. So we can get into that afterwards, but more along the lines of the objects themselves becoming relics and the importance of conservation within that sphere.
I mean, I definitely am actively with you all imagining my objects becoming, I'm going to say ruins because I feel like relics has like a little bit of a more, of a connotation that's a little bit more like invested with idolatry. but I definitely have thought about that, and also about this, like, you know, I mentioned how ceramics can sort of like last for thousands of years and outlast its maker, and it has this nice thing of being both really fragile and really sturdy at the same time. But I do think about conservation, and I think about, I mean, and my drowning of the exhibition is both the things you're talking about. It's both sort of thinking about the museum as like, you know, if its relevance has a timeline on it, and also thinking about the future and what is going to happen to our world, and also thinking about like my particular objects. And the piece over your left shoulder, the white piece on the stand, is far away, but like and I didn't include it in this talk, but the pattern that I painted on it is as if it was broken and put back together. And I really like when you walk through like the Met or the British Museum and you see these antiquities and you can trace the different like theories on conservation by the different parts of them that have been like either resculpted and tried to make seamlessly blend in with the marble, and then another part is like left completely off, and another part is like resculpted but a completely different color so that it's very clear where the repair ends and the piece begins. And so that piece is like one of a few I've done that sort of like play with the aesthetics of repair and conservation. And so it's like also on that level a thing that I think about. And that sort of segues into the last part of your question, which is like that's a whole thing on its own.
Yeah, that is a much longer conversation. I feel like we could start a podcast just on that.
But definitely Greece is, I mean, among many other countries, but since we're talking mostly about Greek relics, that's definitely an issue.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely, it's been a large topic in the museum community, especially as they relate to the Elgin marbles in the British Museum. But it definitely extends to all different types of museums, whether, you know, it is the Getty or the Met, you know, like major institutions or even smaller institutions that have those objects, and how they're attended to, how they're cared for, and who they belong to.
And it's interesting, I mean, like so many of the modernist things that I'm showing, that interest revived right after Elgin's marbles came to the British Museum. Those things are not unrelated either, you know, and so I don't know. It's complicated, and a thing that I probably don't follow as much as people in actual museum positions, but more than the average bear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's a larger question about we don't have to get too much into it, but I think about the ownership of objects and who is most related to them. I kind of want to shift into another conversation. Someone posed a question here. She or he, it's an anonymous person, says that they love the humor and whimsy found so often in your work, and they want to know if it is done on purpose in your creations. And I'm just going to add another aspect to that, which is, you know, how is the choice made of the whimsy versus simply just saying, oh, this is a mark that relates to this?
It's definitely intentional. I think I make a lot of jokes that only I'm gonna see, and so I'm delighted when other people find humor in my work. And I think all of these things are tied together, you know. I think the whimsy and the ambiguity are sort of cousins. And that approach to reducing things down so that it's like barely legible, and it's like in this sort of liminal space where it could be either A or B or Z. And I think that adds to the whimsy too, so that, you know, like Reclining Nude, which I think is a funnier piece. A lot of people see a smiley face in that, in the marks on it that I made, and I totally see like a nipple and boob. But if I had done either of those things really explicitly, it wouldn't feel like a joke anymore. I don't know. And it would also like take it out of its sort of initial reference as an amphora.
I definitely saw a smiley face on there. Yeah, I think again it goes back to this sort of interpretation of how you see these objects, right? How you see the marks that you're making. I also really enjoyed the sort of play on how you've transitioned away from the marks on the works into these sort of they've lost a little bit of the anthropomorphic quality of them, but the columns, they are kind of like these repetitive shapes that almost create a vertical pattern. And I really like kind of when you break up those patterns in the middle, whether they're the metal balls or the piercings, the brass piercings that you have on them. I like all those aspects because it kind of stops your eye from just traveling there and away, but you really need to get into those details. So I also really appreciate those images that you shared where you got really close up to the detail, because I think that is an aspect that certainly we need to have to really feel and understand the quality of the work. Also, if anyone has any other questions for Cammie, please share them in the Q&A or the chat. I do want to kind of add one more question too, which is, I know this is a strange one because it's not necessarily about your artwork, I guess, per se, but it's more about the choices of the images that you used in your presentation.
Okay.
You related them often to the photography that was in the space. And you said once at one point you liked the relationship of the one with Sarah Vanderbeek, and I think that you also kind of commented on the collage by I forget who, and then the other photograph by Whitney Hubbs. The relationship to photography or a flat medium, how does that relate, I guess, in terms of your larger context of praising and receiving inspiration from known works or from other art historical references?
I mean, I think that it is, I do a lot of image research, as many artists do, and I definitely think that either, you know, physical book or the screen, the flat screen image, but those photographs of works comes into play. And I often, but not always, think about how works are going to be viewed. So even though I have different things from different angles, I like mentally think of it as a front and a back, or as, you know, a recto and verso. And so I do think that comes into play, but it's like, it doesn't always come into play in the same ways. In that show that you were referencing, you know, I wasn't there for the documentation. It wasn't like I was setting up the shots, but I was very conscious about how we hung it. And I'm usually extremely involved in the installation of a show. And so the like relationships between the works, the Whitney Hubbs photograph and the Eros and Antros, I sort of like talked about that, just like formal splitting open of material to reveal something else behind it. And the Vanderbeek, you know, decapitated sculpture and my bodiless head pairing. And so like, I was thinking about those pairings maybe more than the images in the case of that show a lot while I was installing it. Fay Ray was the other one, by the way. Also, I was just like, didn't want to not call out those artists when I was showing their work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
There was also a David Cordy painting and a Matte Lips collage that didn't make it into the reduced talk.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too that your work is sometimes put into context with other other work that's more collage based, and in some ways I feel like there's a little bit of a collage between the antiquity aspect, even with your most recent work that you talked about, the breaking of the anatomy of an object is what it's called, that white piece that's in on this side right there. You know, there's a piecing together of these different ideas and the different forms. So in some ways, I feel like your sculpture becomes a collage in and of itself. There's another comment from Facebook from someone who says, so much to consider, overwhelmed by all of the references, but delightedly so. Can you say more about what may come artistically out of filleting your hand?
Oh. Well, it was a real bummer. I still can't feel half of my thumb, and luckily my left hand, and I'm right-handed. And I did it in the service of making art. That was probably obvious, but I don't really know how much it relates. It's kind of like the pieces I've been making during the lockdown, like they both come very fluidly from what I was doing before coronavirus was a thing, and they feel appropriate to the moment. And so those pieces that I mentioned, you know, as I said, they're sort of like, they're really vulnerable and they're asymmetrical, and they're sort of like bent to one side, and I felt very asymmetrical and bent to one side and vulnerable in that moment. So again, I don't know how much to relate it to the accident, but it was a thing in my life that happened, and
yeah. Maybe instead of the artwork representing you, it went the other way around, and you started representing the artwork a little bit, kind of lopsided on that. So one last thing too that I want to bring up, unless there are any other questions too from the audience, is about the concept of the ruin and placing it in the water. And I know that you presented that image of all of the works sort of hanging in some sense. Some of them were hanging, some of them were reclining and placed in the aquariums.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see a sort of evolution of this concept of the environment and the ruinous nature of how it will affect us, relating to that historical context of Greece, and then even bringing in the more contemporary concepts of sexuality and violence and war? How do you see all of that coming together? Because those are a lot of references, you know, that in some ways can pile on, right? So how are you looking at resolving some of those issues as you move forward?
Well, I mean, in terms of violence and sexuality, those aren't like main things I'm focusing on in that work, except to the extent of the sort of impending doom. So there's that aspect of violence. But with those works, I'm thinking about the water specifically. Like, so many of those antiquities were found during dives. You know, there were underwater discoveries, and it was one of the best ways, in fact, to preserve the ceramics. And so it sort of references that like real world, but also romantic notion of finding the antiquities. And I think by doing that further references the antiquities themselves. And then also I think makes this case for like a museum flooding or an impending disaster, meaning flooding, filling every cranny with potable water like you would a bathtub before an earthquake or something. And then there's also this aspect of like other of like creating a new biosphere and other species sort of coming into contact with them, and all of the so it has this kind of like potentially post-human flair, but so I am much more thinking about those things, about how ruins kind of like weigh this balance of past and future as well as present, than I am about some of the things I was referencing more explicitly in other work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good. I think that there's a lot of complexities that go along with that, right? And there's a lot of depth into how each one of these semiotic relationships of our history and our past, of humanity in itself, can really guide how we transform and how we evolve, especially within this time period. And I'm sure that COVID is also affecting those thoughts too, like you touched on the post-human, what comes of us as humans as we evolve, both societally and physically in our bodies. So those are definitely large questions. We do have a last question that I think is a good one to end on. Someone asked about your residency at Lux. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you're going to be working on. Obviously, you won't be at Lux physically because we want to make sure that you are safe and healthy, and that we don't have any sort of issues with visitors, and also because of the situation, we're not allowed to have visitors at the moment. So in the next month period, what are you working on? What do you envision making?
Well, it's really hard to make stuff while I'm floating in virtual space for this month. It's very weird. I think I'm going to be working on some of those vitrine aquariums, and also I kind of referenced but didn't really explicitly say, but for the past couple of months I've been making these vessels that I kind of like break open and twist into being sort of half shells, half amphora, and feel like maybe they're like evolving or maybe devolving or dissolving, and I think I'm thinking of them as like interspecies analogies of like things we creatures leave behind, but also thinking about how like natural history museums and art history museums sort of have more in common in their display tactics than art history and contemporary art museums sometimes. And so I have to figure out kind of how to display those objects and frame them to do all those things I want them to do.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We're looking forward to seeing what you're doing, and please share. You can also follow Lux on Instagram or on Facebook to see more images of Cammie's work, and certainly she's also on Instagram too. You can see some of her posts. And thank you so much for joining us tonight, Cammie. We're pleased to have you, and have a great night.
Thank you. You too. It was my pleasure.
Bye, everyone.